What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Forspoken, which just recently released, which touts itself as a next-gen AAA experience, with both the price and the PC specs to certainly coincide with that. However, if you've watched any recent reviews from its launch, or just seen some opinions on the subject, a lot of that is certainly up for debate. Now, with the review after 100%, I've played this game quite a bit, I have a decent amount to say about it, some positive and certainly some negative. But to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube. And while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video down in the description that will explain everything that I cover, and if you're not subscribed and go to my channel page, you'll see the same thing. Also, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description as well. Now, Forspoken as a game is an open-world third-person action RPG that, while certainly having some impressive visuals, I think falls flat in a few other areas. First and foremost, I want to talk about the story for the title, and at the same time, some of the dialogue and writing. Now, the basic setup for this is that we play as Frey Holland, a young woman from modern-day New York who, after acquiring a magical bracelet, finds herself transported to the magical land of Athia, which is itself dealing with a very pressing crisis that sees people effectively turned into magical zombies by an event that they call the Break, which is more or less a magical plague. Now, while I'm not going to be spoiling the rest of the story, there are some things I want to talk about here, and generally speaking, I think the setup is interesting, the middle is boring, and most of the interesting stuff happens at the very end of the game. The beginning of the game is very linear. It takes a few hours for the game to actually open up, and the first few hours are a very on-the-rails experience that do most of the legwork in setting up what the game is trying to do. And then eventually you'll be put into the open world, at which point the story progression becomes relatively minimal unless you're actually only clearing the story objectives, at which point the game will run you maybe 12 to 15 hours, with the open world section adding probably another 30 to 40 hours of content depending on how much of that you want to do. And broadly speaking, I think the story is okay. I don't think it's really going to wow anybody. It's very average. Again, most of the interesting stuff doesn't happen until like the last couple hours, which brings us to some of the writing and dialogue. Now, this has been going around quite a bit before this particular review, so I've got a decent idea of what a lot of people think of the dialogue and writing as it stands, but to add my own 2 cents in and to talk about a few things I haven't seen other people mention is that on the positive end of things, the very beginning of the game actually portrays Frey as effectively a homeless person squatting in an abandoned building, and believe it or not, I actually think that part of the game is probably the best bit of storytelling they do here, because as someone who has been in that position, I think they nailed that experience. I've talked about this on the channel previously, but I was homeless as a teenager and I have slept in many abandoned buildings, frankly. And you can say what you want about the rest of the dialogue, etc., but I'm telling you as a person who has lived this experience, the way that they portrayed the hopelessness of her situation and how she feels about it was very well done. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum, the dialogue and the rest of her writing is very much so hit or miss. Personally, I'm pretty neutral on it. I play a lot of games, and this is far from the worst dialogue I've seen in a video game. But because our hero is new to Athia and just learning that she can do magic, she's naturally pretty shocked about that, and how she chose to express it, or how it was written that she expressed it, didn't land well for a lot of people. Again, for me, pretty neutral on it. It seems with the full context of the situation that it's fine. But at the same time, I do think the fact that it's fine for a game that's touting to be some next generation experience with a hefty price tag, being just fine is also potentially a problem. But as a result, the story in particular kind of varied between honestly pretty good at parts to definitely some pretty big lows. And ultimately the story becomes average, and I think for the most part it's not something people are going to be talking about in a few years, and it's certainly not going to blow you away. Now, from there, let's actually talk progression systems a little bit, and then we'll talk how the open world works. But I mentioned this was an RPG, so what do we have going on there systems-wise? Now, as we play the game, of course, complete various objectives out in the open world, that kind of thing, we'll be gaining experience and leveling up our character. The primary thing this does is give us mana. Mana is then spent on unlocking spells for us to use in combat. However, our effectiveness in combat comes down to stats tied primarily to our equipment, but also some passive stats that you get just from completing various open world objectives and ticking the checklist of things to do. But over the course of the game, we'll get access to 4 different trees of various spells that we can use in combat, starting with, of course, our own first tree and then gaining more as the game carries on, which gives you access to different kinds of magic. Each of these trees, in order to gain and upgrade the spells therein, requires you to spend mana. Some of this you'll gain just by leveling up, and then a lot of it can be found just by traversing the open world, as it's kind of just out there, so it's pretty easy to grind this stuff up if you just really want to, and that's how you unlock the spells. However, you can also upgrade these spells via a system called Spellcraft, which is effectively just completing a challenge for that individual spell, such as killing a certain number of enemies with it or performing some other function that will generally make your life easier. Now, for your parkour spells, as the world traversal involves a lot of magical parkour, this usually does things like either reduce or remove the stamina cost from performing certain actions, or potentially even giving you more stamina when you do it instead. And because of that, upgrading the parkour skills in particular can be very helpful, though upgrading any spell within a particular tree will give you a bonus to that particular tree's type of magic, which is color-coded. Each tree also has a couple of spells that are gained by finding founts out in the open world that will just unlock the spell for you automatically. Most of these tend to be related to traversal, such as unlocking the ability to float in midair, and that kind of thing. But some of the more important spells to keep in mind are the ones that actually increase your ability to craft equipment. Which brings us to crafting and equipment. So, equipment is primarily cosmetic in nature. Most of the effectiveness of any given bit of equipment is actually how much you dedicate to crafting. We can ultimately wear a cloak as well as a necklace, both of which can be brought to maximum stats for the most part, and then we have options for our fingernails that will give you various bonuses. Those can't really be upgraded, they just kind of are what they are. However, your cloak and your necklace, again, primarily a cosmetic option, as they all kind of wind up in the same place. With the exception of the cloak, there is one in particular that can have 4 upgrades instead of 3, which technically makes it the best, but it's at the very end of the game in an optional area, if you ever get that far, that you'll find that one, so I don't imagine most people will see it. When it comes to our cloak and necklaces, we have a few options here. Generally speaking, they each have 3 sort of upgrade slots where we can enchant it, so to speak, with a unique effect, and you can swap these in and out as you please, provided you've learned them. You can learn various effects to add to these by either finding equipment that has them, or purchasing a few books from one vendor in the only town. So in this way, you can customize some of the unique effects on each piece of equipment, but in addition to this, you can also upgrade the base stats of each item, which are health, defense, and then a magic boost for each of your color-coded types of magic. Now, once you get your spells to a certain point, it's possible to completely upgrade each piece of equipment to the maximum, which is 100, and while each piece of equipment has a sort of base starting area, if you use the crafting system, this becomes primarily a cosmetic choice, and you can upgrade each individual piece of equipment to the best possible case, which I would highly recommend you do, because the amount of upgrading you can do for each bit of equipment can make you incredibly overpowered, especially if you take the time to actually do it. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the combat section, because for now I'm going to talk about the gameplay and the actual world building. Now, the first thing I want to talk about with the gameplay and everything is that visually, this game is gorgeous. I really enjoyed the way this game looked, a lot of the various spell effects, things like that. Visually, it's very cool. My only real complaint here is that a lot of the sort of side characters look a bit rough in comparison to everything else, and you can kind of tell that the focus was on the landscape, the monsters, and of course the main characters. But in the one city in the game, called Sepal, you can see a lot of lackluster, let's say, character models, animations, things that just look kind of janky in comparison to the rest of it. But beyond that, we are using our magical parkour across an open world. The open world is divided up into a handful of sections, and your ability to traverse said world comes down to how much of the story and magic you've gotten your hands on, thus giving you the abilities needed to traverse the world effectively. Now, the magical parkour I honestly thought was really cool. It is fun getting around this world, especially as you you gain more and more abilities that both make traversal easier, the parkour actually give you stamina instead of costing stamina, that kind of thing, to the point where it feels really good and fluid to move through the world very quickly, set against some pretty beautiful landscapes. However, that's pretty much where my praise for the world kind of ends, because the rest of it is very generic AAA open world stuff that does nothing to push forward games. In fact, in some ways, I'd argue it's a bit of a step back. You see, the open world is, beyond its visuals, just very uninspired. There's just nothing going on out there. It's just a checklist of things to do, running to various things to see, points of interest, and sure, a lot of those will grant you stats and upgrades to your abilities, as well as different bits of equipment. All of that ultimately just comes down to going to a place, killing a few enemies, finding a few notes, or clearing a dungeon via combat, and that's pretty much it. There's not much more to say. There are no side quests to really be found, as Sepal is the only safe place for human beings, which means the only place you talk to other people at is in the main city, which means all of the side quests are contained to that city pretty much, outside of a few that are like, hey, go get this thing from this place. Which means the open world can't even be redeemed by interesting side quests because none of them take place out there. The only thing you're going to find out in the open world is enemies to fight, as well as the occasional bit of sort of platforming via the magical parkour system. And that is a problem that is further exacerbated by the game's combat system, because all there is to do in the open world really is engage with the combat. But before we talk about the combat, I will say, one thing I was a little disappointed that they didn't lean into more was all of the world building that they actually did. Because in a lot of areas you'll go through, you'll find notes and everything, and it will basically explain the history of what happened to the world as the break swept through and killed all these people. It also details prior events back before that happened, and all of that stuff is actually pretty interesting, but none of it's really in the game. It is a little bit, especially towards the end if you're paying attention, but they built this really interesting world full of all of these events, and then it's just told to you. You don't actually see any of it, which feels kind of counterintuitive for a video game in particular. And it's frustrating because, again, the open world just has nothing else going on. And yet they had all this really interesting lore and stuff built and in the game that you can read. And if I had actually seen some of that stuff, I might have a higher opinion of the things you could do. But from there, let's actually talk about the combat system. Now, the combat system for me is a really mixed bag, because on one hand, I really enjoy the way that the combat works. That is to say, using all of your different spells, especially when you get access to all the trees, you can weave all of them together in combat to make up these combos and do a lot of stuff that feels really cool. Unfortunately, the game in no way tries to challenge you. And while there are difficulties, and we'll talk about that in a second, what I mean by this is that the enemies simply are not capable of providing you a real challenge, no matter what the difficulty is on. Because while the game has 3 different difficulties, as well as some other variables that you can add or turn off to customize it a little bit, that's not going to change the fact that the fundamental behavior of the enemies is simply not a challenge. Because our character, with our magical parkour, can flit around the screen and become almost impossible for enemies to hit, outside of just being vastly outnumbered and getting hit by something off screen, which absolutely will happen. But beyond that, you're just not going to get hit provided the enemy's actually on the screen for you to see, because most of them are incredibly slow. And the game tries to counter this by providing you just massive amounts of enemies to fight at various places, and that's really the only way they can even try to add a challenge to the title. And this is to the point where you can take on a lot of enemies in a manner that really shouldn't work, but does because they provide so little threat. For instance, I should have some gameplay here where I'm fighting an enemy that is resistant to the type of magic I'm using. I'm way under-leveled, I really shouldn't even be fighting the thing, but I still managed to kill it without taking a single hit because of how very predictable they are, and it was supposed to be like a mini-boss. Nothing about this game provides challenging combat, and that's a problem because most of the game is combat, which I find especially frustrating personally because the combat system that they made, or at least how your character uses it, is interesting. We have our 4 types of magic. Each one of those types has a primary and support ability that we can set. We have quite a few options there. Support in particular has a bunch. Each type of magic has also 3 different attack options. There's a basic attack, a charged attack, all of your various support spells, and then each type of magic gets a sort of ultimate called a surge, and enemies have resistances to various types of magic, and you have to sort of weave and use them effectively in combat, which is fun to use, but is let down by, frankly, poor enemy design, because it feels like most of the effort went into the enemy's visuals and not actually making a compelling combat experience. The only time this game is even remotely difficult is if you start the game on hard and deliberately don't level up your character or increase your stats and choose to make it as difficult as possible. But even on hard mode, if you take the time to explore the world, upgrade your abilities, craft new equipment, you're going to hit a point where even then your stats far outpace what the enemy is capable of doing, even in greater numbers. And ultimately on combat, the framework for a good system is there, but it fails to land. And that brings us to Steam Deck compatibility. Unsurprisingly, with this game having pretty outrageous PC specs, it does not play particularly well on the Steam Deck. Its official rating is unsupported, and while you can play the game, and I should have some footage here for that, it's certainly not what I would consider a good experience, as even on the game's lowest setting, you're still not going to get a particularly good frame rate, it's going to look pretty bad. But it is actually playable, it does have controller support, it does have cloud saves, which means you can technically play this on the Steam Deck, but it's not going to be a good experience to the point it's arguably the worst experience you could have with this particular type of game, which is a little bit of a shame because if it ran better here, I think you could make the case for sort of playing this sort of action-oriented combat on the go, which could have given it a more reasonable use case, at least on that bit of hardware, which makes that playable but not recommended. But speaking of some more technically minded stuff, I wanted to wrap this up by mentioning a few things here. Personally, I played this on PC, and as someone who reviews games for a living, does a lot of editing, etc., I have a relatively high-end PC for this kind of thing, and my PC does actually meet the sort of like ultra specs, if you will. Just barely, but it does. And my experience with this PC was, for the most part, pretty good. I had some minor issues, the game crashed exactly once across about 50 hours, and every once in a while I'd have to deal with some screen tearing, things like that would require me to reload the game to fix. However, just a quick review of people with more mid-range systems reveals a host of optimization errors on PC that make the game a bit of a nightmare for people with, say, a 10 series or 20 series graphics card to actually play, which again, given the specs for PC that were on offer, isn't really much of a surprise, but certainly unfortunate to know. Now, at the same time, Square Enix, the publisher, is known for a lot of kind of choppy PC ports, especially when it comes to things like the control layouts, and interestingly enough, I think they nailed that part of it for once. The controls for PC are actually pretty good. You can remap pretty much everything. All of it actually works as it's supposed to, which for Square Enix is actually above and beyond in terms of controls for PC. But in addition to this, the game does feature various accessibility options that I think are nice to see, in spite of the game's other problems, such as help pointing out items, help with dealing with some of the lock-picking puzzles that are in place, automatic item gathering, customizations to exactly how things like UI settings work, and it's nice to see those options, so I wanted to actually call that out here. But that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, I've really only got two, and that is that the game is gorgeous. Visually, I really enjoyed the experience, provided, of course, you have the system to run that. And then in addition to this, traversing the open world was very fun. The magical parkour system was really cool. I enjoyed messing around with that. And actually getting around the open world was a good experience. Now, on the negative side of things, for starters, the combat. While I liked the idea behind our spells and abilities and things, that falls flat against enemies that honestly pose no threat, kind of regardless of what you do here, which makes for a combat experience that frankly isn't very compelling. Then of course we have the empty world. There's just not a lot going on out in the open world that's really worth the time to explore. And if you beeline the story, you're only looking at like 15 hours of content. Another big negative, especially if you're on PC, is the specs required to run the game in and of itself, as most people simply aren't going to meet them. And in many cases, even if you do meet them, the game's still going to run poorly for you on PC. So all of that brings me to my conclusion. Ultimately, while the concept of Forspoken is pretty interesting, it really just boils down to more of the same AAA open world that we've seen for ages before, and on top of that, it is both expensive and hard to run, which I think vastly overshadows the few good things that this game does. Which is a shame because this game does have its good moments, they're just so few and far between in comparison to everything else that it becomes difficult to recommend, quite frankly, and when you combine that with both the asking price, which is a $70 base price in the US, though regional pricing has it in much more other places, on top of the already ridiculous PC specs, it becomes impossible to recommend this on PC, which means if you're looking to play this on PC, I would just recommend you not buy it. However, if you are looking to play this on console, I would then recommend that you buy it on sale, because while it will at least play and you can have a good time messing around, at least in short bursts, that's certainly not worth the asking price. So to recap, on PC, I just wouldn't buy this at all. I just flat out would not recommend it. And then on console, I would wait until this is at least half off. Because while people have certainly made a big deal about things like the dialogue, etc., I think this game's actual problems are much more intrinsic to what the game is, in terms of its generic open world and combat that fails to do anything interesting, which is the only thing that really fills that open world. So that, guys, is my review of Forspoken after 100%. I certainly hope you enjoyed this look at it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But truly, thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. I truly do appreciate it. The channel is growing every day, and I can't thank you enough. So may you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.